Men don't like what they see. The most shocking truth hitting men right now is that most women do not actually like men at all, and they never really did in the way men hoped or believed for generations. Listen to that for a second, because once you see it clearly, everything changes and you will never look at dating or relationships the same way again. And that realization is exactly why you need to stick with this all the way to the end, because what comes next is the raw pattern recognition that explains why men are walking away in record numbers and why women are waking up to a loneliness they created themselves and cannot fix, no matter how loud they complain or how many demands they make. Men are starting to figure women out on a level that goes way beyond surface level complaints about dating apps or bad behavior, and what they are discovering is a fundamental mismatch in how women view the world and how men experience it. And this mismatch has been building for decades under the cover of progress and equality. But now the mask is off and the picture is sobering as hell. Men do not like what they see when they finally take an honest look at how modern women think and operate, because the evidence keeps stacking up in every direction, from personal experiences to observable patterns across society. And it all points to the same uncomfortable conclusion that women are in serious trouble precisely because they push things too far for too long, and men have reached their limit with no intention of turning back. Women are discovering the hard way that decades of telling men they are not needed, or that their natural traits are toxic, or that providing and protecting somehow makes them villains has finally sunk in, and men have listened and they have adjusted their behavior accordingly by simply stepping back and focusing on their own lives instead of pouring endless energy, time, and resources into situations that offer no real reciprocity or peace. The harsh reality is that most women do not like most men, nor do they genuinely care about what men go through on a daily basis, what men feel, or even whether men live or die. And that is not some exaggeration pulled from thin air. It is the pattern that emerges when you strip away the social scripts and look at actions over words for years on end. Women have been raised and encouraged to believe the entire world revolves around their feelings and their needs. And as a result, many have developed an outlook where men exist primarily as tools or obstacles rather than as human beings with their own value and inner world. And this mindset runs deeper than any temporary trend in dating culture. Even when men remove themselves completely from the equation by choosing independence and self focus, women still express resentment at the mere idea that men could exist happily without centering women. And that reaction reveals something profound about the emotional drivers at play, because it is not just about proximity or daily interactions, it is about a deeper discomfort with men having autonomy and peace on their own terms. To understand this, you have to move past the red pill basics that tell you women do not think exactly like men and step into the black pill territory where the full scope of female nature comes into view, and it is darker and more instinct driven than most guys want to admit at first. The red pill wakes you up to the fact that hypergamy and branch swinging are real, but the black pill forces you to confront how little logic or long term reasoning actually guides those behaviors, and how feelings and immediate emotional validation take priority, even when the consequences are destructive for everyone involved, including women themselves. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this clearly back in the 1800s when he wrote his essay on women and laid out observations that still hit like cold water today, because he described women as childish, frivolous, and short sighted, essentially big children, all their lives operating as an intermediate stage between actual childhood and full adult male reasoning. And he backed it up by pointing out how rarely women produce genuine artistic genius or philosophical depth, and how their role in society has historically centered on reproduction and early child rearing rather than abstract intellectual pursuits. He rejected the romanticized reverence for women that his culture pushed, calling it a kind of stupidity that ignored biological realities, and he argued against elevating women into roles that demanded the kind of sustained judgment and justice oriented thinking that comes more naturally to men. Schopenhauer viewed monogamy as unnatural in many ways and saw women primarily through their instinctual drives rather than any idealized equality. And while his language was blunt and pessimistic by modern standards, the patterns he described keep showing up in contemporary behavior when you pay attention without emotional filters. Men are finally connecting those historical dots with what they see in real time through pattern recognition. And it is sobering because it suggests that some aspects of female nature have not changed as much as society pretends, and that ignoring them has led to the chaos we are living through now. Women have spent the last 50 years or more punishing men for the simple acts of existing, providing, and protecting, and they have done it through waves of cultural movements that frame masculinity itself as the problem while excusing or celebrating female instincts that avoid accountability at every turn. Feminism and related social campaigns have weaponized terms and systems to challenge men constantly, from everyday behaviors like how a man sits or stands to larger structures like family courts that extract resources indefinitely. And the instinct behind it is not accidental. It is wired deep and reinforced by a worldview where feelings trump consequences every single time. Women do not naturally build in the same kind of logical breaks that prevent escalation into self destructive or outright harmful actions because their thinking is powered first and foremost by raw, unrestrained emotions. And that setup leaves little room for the kind of sober reflection that would stop the cycle before it spirals. This is why men are waking up and realizing that continuing to invest in dating and relationships under the old rules is no longer worth the cost because the return is shallow at best and devastating at worst. And walking away becomes the rational choice once the patterns lock into place. Decades of being told that men are not needed, that masculinity is toxic, and that boys should be reshaped to fit female preferences have finally produced a generation of men who took the message seriously and decided to live by it in their own way by opting out entirely and keeping their money, energy, and attention for themselves. Women invented all sorts of ways to criminalize natural male behavior, from manspreading complaints to public shaming videos posted online, and they leveraged courts and social pressure to turn everyday interactions into potential traps for men. And the result is predictable. Men learned to stop engaging on those terms. At the gym or in public spaces, women would dress in ways that demanded attention and then record or accuse men for even glancing or speaking. And that kind of mixed signal chaos trained men to disengage rather than risk the fallout. Paternity issues became something treated lightly in some circles, while victim culture elevated women as perpetual targets, needing protection and resources from the very men painted as villains, and the double standard was obvious to anyone paying attention. Women demanded expensive dates and free meals, knowing full well the man had almost no chance of real connection or intimacy, and then moved on without remorse, using groups and apps to share information that could damage a man's reputation permanently. All of these behaviors added up over time, and men listened, they observed, they recognized the game was rigged against them, and they chose peace instead of endless pursuit. Being alone is not the same as feeling lonely once a man makes peace with himself and builds a life that aligns with his own nature. And that shift has been profound because it reveals just how shallow many relationships with women actually were when stripped of the provider expectations and social pressure. Women who claim their mere presence is the table and that men should feel lucky to sit there are discovering that men no longer accept that framing. And instead, they are focusing on minimalist lives of genuine comfort and self directed happiness. Men have always stood between harsh reality and the protections it offered women, but those days are ending fast, and now women are facing the consequences directly through their own social media posts where they complain about how impossible survival feels without the support they once took for granted. Every day, more voices from women appear begging or demanding that men return to dating, paying for things, and providing attention. But men are done with that script because they see through the lies and the games and they trust observable reality over words. The game was rigged from the start, with apps designed to keep men paying while delivering low returns, ghosting, and mismatched expectations. And now those same platforms are struggling as men cancel subscriptions and walk away, entirely refusing to fund systems that treat them as endless wallets with little chance of meaningful connection. Men are no longer approaching women in the old ways because the risks outweigh the rewards, and the patterns show that effort is rarely matched with appreciation or reciprocity. Women hit the wall in their 30s and beyond, and suddenly realize the stable good men they dismissed earlier are no longer interested in settling for what remains after years of chasing excitement or independence. And that regret is spreading, but it comes too late for many because men have already chosen self preservation over drama. Society is starting to feel the effects as women experience the loneliness epidemic they helped create by straying from natural orders of mutual value and respect. And men, on the other hand, are thriving in their independence, keeping their resources resting without constant worry about family expenses or relationship maintenance, and focusing purely on personal growth and peace. The shift is visible everywhere, from declining engagement on dating platforms to the quiet satisfaction men report when they stop chasing validation and start building lives that actually fulfill them on their terms. Women rewarded non committal behavior for years through hookup culture, and now they face the reverse dynamic where good men refuse to invest in guarded versions of relationships after seeing how freely excitement was handed out earlier. Entitlement has killed appreciation in so many interactions where women expect men to cover grooming costs, outfits, and experiences while offering little in return, and then label non payers as inadequate, which only accelerates the withdrawal. Men are minimalists by nature when left to their own devices, and they are shedding the unnecessary burdens that modern expectations piled on, removing what does not serve them and zeroing in on what brings real happiness without the chaos that often accompanied female centered dynamics. Rediscovering themselves after years of being told their natural traits were problems has been liberating, and it shows in the way men carry themselves with quiet confidence rather than desperate pursuit. The stories playing out on social media from women planning dozens of dates in a month or lamenting empty apartments at night only highlight the gap between the independence sold as empowering and the emotional reality that hits when no one is there to share the quiet moments or handle practical needs that independence never fully solved. Men used to bring flowers, plan thoughtful dates, and offer consistent effort, but repeated lack of respect and gratitude trained them to stop, and now women are left confused, wondering why the chase has disappeared and why men seem indifferent to the old scripts. This is not about hate or exaggeration. It is about facing the observable truth that female nature, driven heavily by emotion over sustained reason, leads to patterns that create self sabotage on a societal scale, and men recognizing that truth are protecting their own mental and financial well being by simply stepping back. Schopenhauer warned that women live more for the species in some instinctual sense, yet their individual actions often undermine long term stability. And the current landscape proves his pessimistic lens had merit because the push for equality ignored biological and psychological differences that do not vanish with slogans or laws. Accountability avoidance is baked in deep, and it manifests in blame, shifting to men, apps culture, or anything except personal choices made over years. And that refusal to reflect only deepens the isolation when the consequences arrive. Men have learned that solitude Chosen consciously brings more peace than relationships built on unbalanced expectations, and they are embracing it fully. The dating market feels cooked for many women because men refuse to overextend for low effort connections, and they are staying single in growing numbers, prioritizing financial stability, self improvement, and freedom over chasing validation or filling emotional voids that never seem satisfied. Women complain about ghosting flakiness and lack of pursuit, but fail to see how their own standards and behaviors contributed to the exhaustion men feel after repeated cycles of mixed signals and entitlement. At singles events, churches, or everyday settings, the imbalance shows up with plenty of women present, yet fewer men inspired to engage because the inspiration to commit requires mutual value that has been eroded over time. Feminism promised liberation, but delivered a generation facing the wall undefeated, where youth and fertility pass and options narrow while men age into greater refinement and choice. Men are holding the line on dating apps by refusing to pay for boost subscriptions and premium features that never delivered fair matches or genuine connections, and the companies behind them are feeling the financial pressure as revenue models built on male spending start to crack. Burnout is real, with surveys showing high percentages of young people tired of the gamified systems full of algorithms that favor superficial traits and punish genuine approaches, and men are choosing real life interactions or no interactions at all over the endless swipe and disappointment cycle. Adverse selection fills these platforms with users gaming the system through fake profiles, AI assistants, or strategic tricks. And the result is a toxic environment where trust erodes and men decide the juice is not worth the squeeze. Overseas options sometimes look better for those seeking traditional dynamics, but even there, the core lesson remains that men thrive when they stop funding broken systems and start investing in themselves. Women in their 40s and beyond describe feeling invisible to men their age, realizing too late that the strong, independent path left them without the family or partnership structures that once provided stability and meaning, and the commentary around those stories points back to choices made in youth when commitment was delayed or dismissed in favor of career fun or casual experiences. Social media exposes the true nature of these dynamics faster than ever, allowing men to see patterns in real time and choose peace over potential disruption to their lives. The wall is not just a meme, it is a biological and social reality that no amount of procedures or denial can fully erase. And men who understand this are no longer willing to ignore it when selecting partners or deciding whether to engage at all. This wake up is spreading quietly but powerfully as more men connect the dots from historical philosophy like Schopenhauer to daily observations, and they realize the black pill lens reveals truths the red pill only begins to touch. Female psychology is not driven by the same logical frameworks men often assume, and pretending otherwise has led to decades of mismatched expectations and resentment. Men are done being the villains in a narrative that paints them as disposable providers while excusing instincts that create chaos for attention and validation. They are building simple lives of luxury in the sense of comfort without excess focusing on what truly matters to them and letting go of the rest. Society may collapse in certain ways as women face the full weight of their independence, but men are positioning themselves to thrive through self reliance and clear boundaries. The men are gone from the old game, and they are not coming back on the previous terms because the cost was too high and the rewards too uncertain. And women are left experiencing the silence of apartments at night, the lack of someone to call in crisis, and the realization that emotional needs do not vanish with financial independence. Good men are not dumb. They see the guarded versions offered after years of excitement handed elsewhere, and they choose not to settle for scraps. Entitlement kills appreciation. And when women frame basic efforts as owed rather than valued, the motivation to provide them disappears entirely. Men are rediscovering their own nature, minimalist, focused on peace and happiness, and they are removing the drama that once filled their days. This shift is raw, and it is truthful, and it serves as the sobering wake up call that forces everyone to confront reality instead of comfortable illusions. Men have always protected women from the harshest edges of existence, but that protection came at a price. And now that men are withdrawing, the consequences are landing directly where they were created. The loneliness epidemic among women is self inflicted, in large part stemming from straying from natural orders of respect, reciprocity, and mutual contribution, and no amount of demands or social media posts will reverse the withdrawal once men have internalized the patterns. Continuing from here, the narrative would expand further into detailed explorations of specific behaviors observed across dating culture, the long term societal impacts of accountability avoidance, the philosophical foundations from Schopenhauer, expanded with rhetorical depth, the financial and emotional costs men avoided by walking away, the contrast between male and female life trajectories over decades, the burnout statistics from apps, and how they reflect deeper. Society, the economy, and financial institutions are all on the brink of collapse. Men are waking up and walking away. If you're done with the failing system, check out the Men Walking Away community. Connect with like minded men who are learning how to fully decentralize from modern tech, medicine, food, housing, finance, and society itself. Thrive while others struggle to survive. The link is in the description below. Go check it out now. Mismatches, the way women hit the wall, and the regret narratives that emerged too late, the minimalist revolution among men, finding peace in simplicity, the collapse of old courtship models, and the rise of self focused living, the instinctual drives that Schopenhauer highlighted and how they play out today without filters, and the ultimate freedom men discover when they trust observable reality over societal scripts, all told in the same long paragraph flow, building the story layer by layer without repetition to reach the full depth required. The numbers coming out in recent years paint an even clearer picture of the scale of this withdrawal because surveys show that only about 30% of young adults are actively dating, either casually or exclusively, with just a quarter of women and a little over a third of men reporting they date once a month or more, while nearly three-quarters of women and two-thirds of men had not dated or had only a few dates in the entire previous year. And that kind of widespread disengagement did not happen by accident. It stems directly from men recognizing the unbalanced dynamics and choosing to protect their time, energy, and money instead of feeding into systems that deliver constant rejection, ghosting, and low value returns. Dating apps that once promised connection have turned into money pits for men who are now canceling subscriptions, refusing boosts, and walking away from paywalls entirely, which has left companies like Bumble down over 90% since going public, and Match Group facing similar financial pressure because the entire business model relied on men paying for features while women swiped freely, and the algorithms favored superficial traits and kept users hooked through gamification tactics that mimicked addictive games rather than fostering real compatibility. Men report getting one like every week or two at best, which makes the experience humbling and often demoralizing, especially when women, even average ones, rack up thousands of likes, creating a queue that feels impossible to navigate, and the result is burnout on both sides. But men are the ones voting with their wallets by deleting the apps and refusing to fund the enshittification, where platforms degrade over time, adding more subscriptions and premium options that deliver less and less actual connection. This burnout hits Gen Z particularly hard, with surveys indicating that nearly 80% of dating app users feel emotionally, mentally, or physically exhausted, sometimes often or always. And young people are spending close to an hour a day on these platforms only to face repeated disappointment, lack of meaningful matches, and the constant cycle of repetitive conversations that go nowhere. And while women deal with unwanted, explicit messages and harassment, men face the bulk of rejection and the feeling of being invisible unless they fit the narrow top tier criteria that the algorithms push to the front. The adverse selection problem makes it worse because as soon as a new app gains traction with genuine users looking for real relationships, the sleazy types and liars flood in gaming profiles with fake photos, strategic lies, and tricks that ruin the experience for everyone and push quality people out until the platform becomes toxic and men decide the whole thing is not worth their effort anymore, especially when real life interactions at the gym, the grocery store, or through friends still offer better odds without the financial drain or emotional roller coaster. Men are holding the line on this, and it is forcing the apps to panic because when the primary payers stop funding the broken system, the revenue models collapse, and no amount of new features like double dates or authenticity pushes can hide the fundamental mismatch between what men invest and what they receive in return. Women in their 30s and 40s are starting to voice the confusion, openly wondering why dating has gotten harder for them instead of for men. And the answer lies in the simple truth that men have stopped overextending for low effort connections and no longer chase validation through expensive dates, flowers, or constant pursuit because they have learned that being themselves and setting clear boundaries yields better personal peace than trying to please someone whose standards shift like the wind once basic attention is secured. Clips and stories show women planning dozens of dates in a single month through apps like Hinge and Bumble, yet complaining about ghosting flakiness and lack of follow through, while men on the other side are refusing to pay for meals or experiences when there is no clear reciprocity or genuine interest. Because entitlement has killed appreciation. And when someone feels owed something, they stop valuing the effort put in, and that dynamic plays out repeatedly in modern interactions, where women expect men to cover grooming costs, outfits, and entertainment as if it is the bare minimum, yet offer guarded versions of connection that feel more like transactions than mutual building. At singles events, even in places like churches with over 1,000 attendees, the crowd skews heavily female, and men are noticeably absent because they have calculated that many of the women present are seeking help or provision rather than true partnership. And good men are not dumb. They see the pattern of past choices where excitement was rewarded in youth and stability was dismissed as boring, only for the script to flip later when options narrow and the wall becomes undeniable. The biological and social reality is that as women age, the demand from men decreases while competition from younger, more feminine options increases, and no amount of denial or claims that 50 is the new 30 can change the supply and demand mechanics that govern attraction and long term pairing, because men, especially successful ones in their 30s and beyond, prefer youth softness and the kind of energy that aligns with building rather than managing past baggage or guarded independence that leaves little room for genuine vulnerability. Women who embraced the strong, independent path in their 20s often reflect later on the quiet weekends, the empty apartments, and the realization that emotional needs do not disappear with financial self sufficiency or career success. And the sadness that comes from carrying the full burden of life alone hits harder when peers have built families and support networks that provide the holding and sharing they once took for granted or actively rejected as unnecessary. Independence solved survival questions for some, but it never addressed the deeper human craving for companionship, intimacy, and someone to face the ordinary days with. And now women are left describing single life at 40 as feeling like being a teenager with money and no rules, yet still profoundly lonely because the freedom they chased came at the cost of the natural structures that once offered stability without constant performance or validation seeking. Men, on the other hand, are rediscovering the satisfaction of minimalist living, where they shed unnecessary complications, focus on self improvement, financial stability, and personal hobbies, and find that peace comes easier when drama, entitlement, and one sided expectations are removed from the equation entirely. And this shift is not about bitterness, it is about pattern recognition that tells them investing heavily in relationships that rarely deliver mutual respect or long term reciprocity drains resources that could build their own security and happiness instead. Schopenhauer captured elements of this centuries ago when he observed that women tend to live more for the species in an instinctual sense, seeing affairs of propagation and immediate emotional concerns as central, while men grapple more with individual judgment, justice, and abstract reasoning. And although his language was blunt, the core insight about differing priorities and the childish short sighted tendencies that prioritize present feelings over sustained consequences still echoes in contemporary behaviors where accountability is avoided and blame shifts outward rather than inward when outcomes disappoint. He noted how women remain in a kind of intermediate state between child and full adult reasoning, seeing only what is near at hand, clinging to appearances, and preferring trifling matters, which aligns with the way modern dynamics reward immediate validation through social media apps and casual encounters while punishing the patient, consistent effort that builds real bonds. And men who internalize that distinction stop expecting logical reciprocity and instead protect their own frame by disengaging from cycles that lead nowhere productive. The dating recession we are living through shows up clearly in the data, with marriage rates at historic lows, the median age for first marriage climbing toward 31 for men, and record numbers of people in their 40s never having married at all. And this is not some temporary blip caused by economic factors alone. It reflects a deeper cultural mismatch where men have done the math on the risks of divorce, courts, financial extraction, false accusations, and emotional labor that goes unappreciated, and decided that staying single or keeping things extremely casual offers better odds for their well being than signing up for potential destruction of everything they have built. Young men under 30 show single rates around 63%, according to recent analyses, and many are not even actively looking because they see the landscape as rigged with apps full of adverse selection social movements that frame masculinity as toxic and expectations that men should provide chivalry and effort without equivalent contribution or respect in return. And the result is a generation learning to thrive in solitude rather than chase diminishing returns. Women express frustration at the lack of decent men willing to approach or commit, but fail to connect it to their own role in rewarding non committal players in youth while dismissing stable, reliable guys as boring or insufficiently exciting until the options for those good men expand with age and they choose peace over settling for guarded or entitled versions later on. This confusion among women stems from the moving goalposts that define modern interactions, where attention quickly escalates to demands for validation, commitment, and provision. Yet the reciprocity stays minimal, and men have grown wise to it, refusing to play the role of endless giver when the return feels more like obligation than mutual desire. And at church singles nights or everyday settings, the imbalance becomes obvious, with women outnumbering men and still struggling to inspire the kind of pursuit they expect, because inspiration requires genuine femininity, respect, and the kind of energy that makes a man want to invest rather than protect himself from potential chaos. Feminism and hookup culture played their part by normalizing the rewarding of bad behavior and short term excitement, which train men to expect low investment returns. And now that the consequences are landing, Women face the silence of no approaches, no consistent effort, and the realization that good men are not rushing to settle for what remains after years of prioritizing career fun or casual validation over building with someone solid. Men are no longer dating for validation or to prove something to society. They are focusing inward on becoming better versions of themselves, financially secure, mentally strong, and free from the pressure to perform for someone whose standards rarely align with sustained reality. And that self focus feels liberating because it replaces the old script of endless chasing with deliberate choices that serve long term happiness. The stories from women hitting their 40s highlight the undefeated nature of the wall where biological realities meet social choices, and suddenly the independence that felt empowering becomes a burden when there is no one to share the quiet moments, the practical loads, or the emotional support that humans naturally seek. And comments around these narratives often point out that men age like wine, growing more refined with resources and options, while women face declining demand and increased competition, which is harsh but observable. And no amount of social media copium claiming age is just a number can override the patterns men see in real time through profiles, past behaviors, and the guarded energy that replaces the openness of youth. Men choosing peace are not doing it out of spite. They are responding to exposed realities through social media that reveal the true nature of many interactions where entitlement, mixed signals, and blame shifting dominate. And the last thing a man who has built stability wants is to risk it all on dynamics that social trends have made unpredictable and often destructive. The dating market runs on supply and demand, not feelings, and as women delay or dismiss commitment in their prime years, the pool of willing, high value men shrinks for them later, while men in their 30s and beyond gain leverage through experience, resources, and the freedom to be selective or opt out entirely. Entitlement kills appreciation in the most direct way possible. Because when basic efforts like planning a simple outing or showing consistent interest are treated as owed rather than valued, the motivation to continue evaporates. And men have learned this lesson through repeated cycles where they covered costs, provided experiences, and offered emotional labor, only to face ghosting demands for more or accusations of inadequacy when they set boundaries or walked away from unbalanced situations. Directness has become a filter for men who now state intentions clearly rather than pretending. Every date leads to commitment because pretending wastes time and leads to fraud perceptions on both sides, and rejection used as a tool helps men avoid investing in women who show red flags early, like constant testing of boundaries or expectations of wife treatment from strangers. In 2020, six men are staying single in growing numbers because they see no incentive to overextend for relationships that feel more like help requests than partnerships. And they ignore women demanding traditional roles after years of celebrating independence because the inspiration to lead or provide requires mutual respect and value that many modern dynamics lack. The broader societal impact is unfolding as birth rates decline, sex rates drop, and marriage becomes rarer, especially among those who grew up with the messages that men are optional or toxic and women can have it all without trade offs. And the loneliness epidemic hitting women hardest in their later years reveals the gap between the sold narrative of empowerment and the lived experience of isolation when the support structures of traditional pairing are absent and no career or social media following fully replaces the human need for intimate connection and shared burden. Men are not experiencing the same intensity of loneliness in dating because their satisfaction comes more from achievement purpose and self directed living, which allows them to thrive independently, while women wired more toward relational and emotional fulfillment feel the absence more acutely when those elements are missing. And this difference explains why the withdrawal of male effort creates such visible distress on one side, while the other side reports greater peace and focus. Schopenhauer argued that women pay the debt of life through suffering in childbirth, care, and subjection, rather than through grand actions or intellectual pursuits. And while controversial, the underlying observation about differing roles and temperaments still holds relevance when examining why certain instincts lead to self sabotage in a culture that denies biological realities and pushes equality of outcome over complementary strengths. Men have always been the ones standing between harsh reality and the softer experiences women often prefer. And by removing that buffer, society is forcing a confrontation with consequences that were delayed for decades through welfare systems, cultural narratives, and legal advantages that shielded women from the full weight of their choices. And now, as men walk away, the raw patterns emerge, with women facing survival questions, emotional voids, and the realization that independence without interdependence leaves gaps that apps, careers, or cats cannot fill, no matter how loudly the independence is celebrated. The red pill open eyes to hypergamy and branch swinging, but the black pill digs deeper into the emotional drivers that make long term reasoning secondary to feelings, and that depth is what allows men to make permanent adjustments rather than cycling through hope and disappointment. Because once you see the full scope, the old investment strategies lose all appeal and self preservation becomes the logical path. Pattern recognition is the tool men are using now, trusting observable actions over words and social scripts because words can shift with trends, but repeated behaviors reveal the consistent nature underneath, and those patterns show a preference for chaos validation and avoidance of accountability that clashes with the stability and justice oriented thinking men bring to relationships when they engage fully. This wake up is spreading quietly among men who connect the dots from historical philosophy to daily digital evidence, and they realize that protecting their mental, financial, and emotional resources by disengaging from rigged games serves them better than continuing under outdated rules that society still pretends are fair and balanced. Women in their later years describing the depression of solo gym sessions or open houses where they feel the weight of life without someone to hold them illustrate the human cost of straying too far from natural orders where mutual contribution and respect created resilience rather than isolation. And the regret narratives emerging now come too late for many because good men have already chosen paths that avoid the risk of becoming disposable once utility diminishes or social media exposes underlying dynamics. The minimalist revolution among men is about shedding excess, focusing on what genuinely brings happiness and comfort, and rediscovering the joy of simple, self directed living that does not require constant negotiation or performance to maintain peace. And that rediscovery feels profound after years of being told their natural traits were problems needing fixing or suppression. Society may label this shift as a crisis or epidemic, but for the men living it, it represents freedom from burdens that were never reciprocated equally and the chance to build lives aligned with their own nature rather than external demands that treated them as resources first and humans second. And as more men internalize the black pill truths, the old courtship models continue to crumble, replaced by deliberate choices that prioritize self over sacrifice in unbalanced equations. The confusion women express about harder dating stems from failing to see how their collective behaviors over decades trained men to expect less return on investment. And now the market has corrected, with men controlling access to commitment while women control initial attention, and the imbalance favors those who refuse to overpay for diminished value. Accountability avoidance runs deep because feelings driven thinking rarely builds in the breaks needed to reflect before consequences compound. And that lack of reflection shows in the way blame lands on men apps or culture instead of personal decisions made repeatedly in youth when options were abundant and warnings were dismissed as outdated or controlling. Men are thriving in their independence by keeping money resting without relationship maintenance worries and focusing on personal growth because minimalist by nature, they remove what does not serve and zero in on purpose, peace, and self mastery, which contrasts sharply with the narratives of struggle coming from the other side, where independence meets its practical and emotional limits. The wall is undefeated, not as punishment, but as biological and social arithmetic that no slogan can erase. And men who understand this stop ignoring it when evaluating long term potential or deciding whether engagement is worth the risk at all. This is the sobering reality unfolding in real time, where decades of pushing men aside, telling them they are toxic or unnecessary, has produced exactly the withdrawal predicted by anyone paying attention to human nature rather than ideological promises. And the loneliness spreading now is the direct result of choices that prioritized short term feelings over long term structures that actually sustained people through ordinary life. The financial strain on the dating platforms themselves tells its own story because companies that built empires on men paying for boost subscriptions and premium features are watching their models crack under the weight of widespread male withdrawal, as Bumble reported a nearly 10% revenue drop to under $1 billion in 2025, with paying users falling over 11% and Match Group facing flat or declining trends despite attempts at AI tools and international pushes, because when the primary spenders stop funding the gamified systems that deliver one, like every couple of weeks for most men, while women sit on queues of thousands, the entire revenue engine starts sputtering, and no amount of new voice notes or algorithmic tweaks can hide the fundamental imbalance where men feel chopped and invisible unless they hit narrow top tier criteria pushed by the apps themselves. Burnout statistics hit hard across the board, with surveys showing around 80% of users, especially Gen Z, feeling emotionally, mentally, or physically exhausted from the constant cycle of repetitive openers, ghosting, and mismatched expectations, where platforms promise, designed to be deleted, connections but deliver endless swiping that mimics addictive loot box mechanics designed to keep people hooked without real success. And men are the ones canceling en masse, refusing to pay for features that rarely translate into meaningful dates or relationships, while women report their own frustrations with unwanted, explicit messages and the emotional drain of navigating a space full of adverse selection where liars and non serious users flood in once any genuine crowd appears, ruining the experience for everyone who actually wants something real. Real life interactions still carry their own challenges, but they avoid the paywalls and algorithmic manipulation that make apps feel like a rigged casino where the house always wins by keeping users frustrated and spending, and men are choosing grocery stores, gyms, or organic settings where they can read body language and energy directly instead of trusting profiles that often hide guarded intentions or inflated standards. And this shift away from funding broken systems is forcing the companies to panic quietly because their growth relied on male desperation and willingness to overpay for low returns. And now that men have calculated the cost benefit and decided peace and solitude beats the emotional roller coaster, the platforms are left scrambling with workforce cuts, cost savings, and desperate rebrands, trying to turn hookup heavy apps into social connection tools. While Gen Z, though, in particular, shows high rates of disengagement, with many reporting they are not even looking for relationships right now, preferring personal growth boundaries and self fulfillment before committing to anyone. The data on singlehood and marriage trends backs up the scale of what is happening, with nearly three-quarters of women and two-thirds of men reporting they had not dated or only dated a few times in the past year, and only about 30% of young adults actively dating casually or exclusively, which reflects a dating recession where men, especially under 30, sit at single rates around 63%, and many are content staying that way because they see no upside in overextending for dynamics that demand provider energy without equivalent appreciation or long term reciprocity, and marriage rates continue their long decline, with record numbers of people in their 40s never having married at all as the median age climbs and young adults delay or forego the institution altogether after watching previous generations deal with divorce court's financial extraction and the kind of chaos that makes signing up feel like a high risk gamble with poor odds. Women express open confusion about why dating feels harder for them as they age into their 30s and 40s, while men seem to gain options and refinement. And the answer sits in the observable supply and demand mechanics that no feelings based narrative can override. Because as women pass their peak years of youth and fertility, the pool of high value men willing to commit shrinks while competition from younger, more open options increases, and good men who have built stability through self focus are no longer rushing to settle for guarded versions of connection or entitled expectations after seeing how freely excitement and validation flowed elsewhere in earlier years. Clips and stories circulate of women in their 40s describing the quiet depression of solo gym sessions or open houses where they carry the full weight of daily life without someone to share the load or hold them through ordinary moments, and they reflect on the strong, independent path that solved survival questions but left emotional voids that career success or social media followers never filled, because humans crave companionship and mutual support in ways that pure self sufficiency cannot replace. And the regret that surfaces now often comes with realizations that the messages of not needing men or viewing marriage as a trap delayed building the very structures that provide resilience when life gets heavy. Men on their side are not experiencing the same intensity of that isolation because their satisfaction tends to come from purpose achievement and self directed living, which allows them to thrive independently without the constant relational performance that many modern dynamics demand. And this difference explains why the withdrawal of consistent male effort creates visible distress on one side, while the other reports greater focus and quiet satisfaction once the drama and one sided expectations are removed. Directness has become a necessary filter in interactions because men have learned that indirect games and pretending every approach leads to commitment waste time and breed resentment when expectations do not align. And stating intentions clearly up front helps avoid the fraud perceptions that arise when basic efforts like a simple outing get treated as owed without reciprocity and rejection, serves as a tool to sort through options faster rather than investing heavily in situations that show red flags like constant boundary testing or moving goalposts from compliments to validation to provision without equivalent energy coming back. At events like large church singles gatherings with over 1,000 attendees, the crowd often skews heavily female, and men are noticeably fewer because many have done the math on the available pool and decided that pursuing women who may be seeking logistical help or provision after years of independence does not inspire the kind of leadership or investment that requires genuine mutual respect and the kind of feminine energy that makes a man want to build rather than protect his own peace from potential disruption. Entitlement shows up in subtle and not so subtle ways where basic gestures that used to be common, like bringing flowers or planning thoughtful, low cost dates, get undervalued or dismissed as bare minimum while demands for expensive experiences or constant attention continue. And men have responded by refusing to pay for dates unless there is clear mutual benefit because they recognize that appreciation dies when effort feels owed rather than valued. And that lesson repeated across enough cycles trains even the most patient guys to pull back and focus resources on their own growth instead. The philosophical lens from thinkers like Schopenhauer adds depth to understanding these patterns because he observed that women often operate with a focus on immediate concerns and the propagation of life seeing affairs through a more species level instinct, while men tend toward individual judgment, justice, and sustained abstract reasoning. And although his views were blunt and rooted in the biology of his time, the core distinction about differing priorities helps explain why certain behaviors create self sabotage in a culture that denies those differences and pushes uniform equality of outcome over complementary strengths that actually sustained societies for generations. He pointed to tendencies toward short sightedness and clinging to appearances which align with the way modern social media and app dynamics reward present validation and chaos for attention while punishing the patient. Consistent effort needed for deep bonds, and men who internalize that insight stop expecting the same logical reciprocity they bring to the table, and instead choose self preservation by disengaging from cycles that lead to repeated disappointment and resource drain. Feminism and the cultural waves that followed played a significant role by framing masculinity as optional or problematic and encouraging women to celebrate independence without highlighting the trade offs that come when natural orders of mutual contribution get disrupted. And the result is a generation facing the practical limits of going it alone when emotional and logistical burdens accumulate without the buffer that traditional pairing once provided through shared responsibilities and respect. Women in their later years often describe the exhaustion of handling everything solo, from yard work to emotional processing, and they voice wishes for partnership after realizing that the freedom sold as empowering leaves gaps in daily life that no amount of self care routines or friend groups fully closes. And yet, the commentary around those stories frequently notes that good men are not falling for last minute shifts toward wanting stable providers. After prime years were spent rewarding non committal behavior or dismissing reliable guys as insufficiently exciting because inspiration to commit requires seeing value in consistency from the start rather than expecting it as a default once options narrow. The dating market does not run on feelings or slogans. It runs on supply and demand arithmetic, where a woman's value in the eyes of committed men tends to peak earlier and faces increased competition later, while men, especially those who focus on self improvement, often gain leverage through resources, experience, and the freedom to be selective or remain single without the same pressure. And ignoring that reality only deepens the confusion when approaches dry up and effort disappears. Social media has accelerated the exposure of underlying dynamics by allowing men to see patterns in real time through countless clips of mixed signals, entitlement, and blame shifting, which desensitizes many to the old courtship scripts and reinforces the choice to prioritize peace over potential chaos that could disrupt hard earned stability. Birth rates and sex rates continue their decline as fewer young people form the stable pairings that historically supported family formation. And this trend ties directly to the broader withdrawal where men opt for minimalist, self focused lives that deliver satisfaction without the risks of divorce, financial loss, or emotional labor that goes unappreciated, and women face the loneliness that surfaces when independence meets its limits in the quiet hours after work or during ordinary weekends when there is no one to share the small moments that make life feel connected. Gen Z shows mixed signals, with many expressing belief in true love and openness to marriage, yet high percentages report not feeling ready due to needs for personal growth, boundaries, and established friendships first, which delays commitment and contributes to the overall dating recession, where nearly half of some age groups project remaining single longer than previous generations, and experts point to economic factors, cultural shifts, and the observed imbalances in apps and real life as drivers that make rushing into relationships feel unwise for many. Men staying single in growing numbers are doing so from a place of calculated awareness rather than Defeat because they see the landscape clearly through pattern recognition that reveals how entitlement kills appreciation and how guarded intimacy offered later does not match the openness and energy available in youth, which good men remember and factor into their decisions about whether to engage at all. The stories of women planning dozens of dates in a month through apps, matchmakers, and even street approaches, only to face ghosting flakiness or connections that go nowhere, highlight the gap between high activity and actual fulfillment because the volume of options does not translate to quality when standards remain elevated and reciprocity stays minimal. And men on the receiving end of those dynamics have learned to protect their time by being direct about intentions or simply walking away when energy does not match, which filters out situations that would otherwise drain them without return. In places like major cities, the complaint about where the decent men are hiding misses the point that many are present, but choosing not to pursue women whose past choices or current expectations signal low likelihood of mutual value, and instead, those men focus on their own circles, hobbies, and self mastery, where they find peace without the need to perform or chase validation that modern interactions often demand in unbalanced ways. The wall remains undefeated as a biological and social reality that procedures denial or claims of age being just a number cannot fully erase, because demand from men shifts toward youth softness and the kind of feminine presence that inspires investment. And as women compete with younger options while carrying the weight of delayed choices, the options for stable, long term pairing narrow in ways that feel sudden and unfair, yet stem from observable patterns built over years of prioritizing other paths. This entire shift represents a correction in the market for relationships where decades of messages telling men they are toxic, unnecessary, or disposable finally sank in and produced exactly the behavior predicted by anyone observing human nature without ideological filters. And men walking away permanently from the old game are not coming back on previous terms because the cost in time, money, and emotional peace prove too high for returns that rarely match the investment, and women are left experiencing the silence that follows when consistent effort and approaches dry up, forcing a confrontation with the consequences of straying from natural complementary dynamics that once provided stability through mutual respect rather than demands or avoidance of accountability. The loneliness epidemic spreading among women in their 30s and beyond is self inflicted in large measure because it stems from choices that rewarded short term validation and independence while dismissing the patient building required for deep bonds, and no amount of blaming apps, culture, or men can change the reality that emotional needs persist regardless of financial self sufficiency. And the structures that once met those needs through shared life have been disrupted by trends that ignored biological and psychological differences. Men rediscovering minimalist living are shedding the unnecessary burdens piled on by expectations of endless providing, and they are zeroing in on what genuinely brings happiness, comfort, and purpose, which feels profoundly liberating after years of being told their natural traits needed fixing or suppression. And that rediscovery allows them to thrive without the drama that often accompanied female centered dynamics in the modern era. Schopenhauer warned about the risks of elevating women into roles demanding sustained judgment that their instinctual drives did not naturally prioritize. And although society pushed against that view for decades, the patterns emerging now suggest his pessimistic observations had roots in realities that do not vanish with cultural narratives or legal changes, because accountability avoidance, driven by feelings over long term reasoning, leads to cycles of blame shifting and self sabotage that compound over time and leave women facing isolation when the protective buffers men once provided are withdrawn. The black pill perspective goes deeper than red pill basics by revealing how little sustained logic guides many behaviors and how emotional validation takes precedence even when outcomes prove destructive for everyone involved. And men who absorb that depth make permanent adjustments to their approach, protecting their resources and mental state rather than cycling through hope, disappointment, and repeated investment in unbalanced equations. Pattern recognition serves as the reliable tool now because actions repeated across countless interactions reveal consistent nature more truthfully than words that shift with trends or social pressure. And those patterns show a preference for immediate concerns, chaos for attention and avoidance of personal responsibility that clashes with the justice oriented, stable thinking men bring when they choose to engage fully. Society may frame this male withdrawal as a crisis or epidemic needing intervention, but for the men living it daily, it feels like freedom from burdens that were never matched with equivalent contribution and the chance to align life with their own minimalist nature, focused on self mastery and peace, rather than external demands that treated them primarily as resources or villains in narratives that ignored observable realities. The confusion women voice about dating getting harder for them instead of men stems from failing to connect their collective behaviors over decades to the exhaustion and disengagement men feel after repeated mixed signals and entitlement. And now the market has corrected, with men controlling access to commitment while women control initial attention, creating an imbalance that favors those who refuse to overpay for diminished returns or guarded connections offered after prime years have passed. This wake up spreads quietly, but with real force, as more men link historical insights to digital evidence and daily experiences, realizing that trusting observable patterns over comforting illusions or societal scripts serves their long term well being better than continuing under rules that pretend fairness where none exists in practice. The broader impacts ripple through declining birth rates, lower sex frequency, and rarer marriages, especially among those raised with messages that men are optional and women can have it all without trade offs. And the human cost shows in the voids that independence leaves when relational fulfillment is absent because no career or online presence fully substitutes for intimate connection and shared ordinary days that give life deeper meaning and resilience. Men thriving in independence keep their money rest without relationship maintenance worries and invest in personal growth because they are minimalist by nature, removing what does not serve and concentrating on purpose and comfort, which contrasts with the struggles described from the other side where survival gets solved, but emotional and practical gaps remain unfilled. The wall is not punishment. It is arithmetic of biology and social choice that catches up when options were abundant, yet commitment delayed in favor of other priorities. And men who understand this stop ignoring it when assessing long term potential or deciding engagement is worth any risk at all. This sobering reality unfolding in real time shows how pushing men aside for generations under claims of toxicity or unnecessity has produced the exact withdrawal that logic would predict, and the loneliness now spreading is the direct outcome of straying too far from orders that sustain people through mutual value, respect, and contribution, rather than one sided demands or feelings driven avoidance of consequences. Men have always buffered women from the harshest edges of existence through provision and protection. But withdrawing that buffer forces a direct encounter with reality that was delayed by systems and narratives shielding from full accountability. And now, as men focus inward on self preservation, the patterns become impossible to ignore for anyone paying honest attention. The freedom men discover in chosen solitude after making peace with themselves reveals how shallow many previous dynamics were when stripped of provider expectations and social pressure. And that shift allows genuine happiness built on their own terms without the chaos created for validation or attention that often defined interactions before. Industry projections show the global dating app market still pushing toward higher totals through expanded international reach and new monetization tricks. But the core user base in mature markets is showing clear fatigue, with total paying subscribers stuck around 25 million out of over 350 million total users worldwide, and companies like Match Group pulling in around $3.5 billion in 2024 while facing flat or declining paying user counts in key segments as men cancel premium features and refuse to chase algorithmic visibility that rarely delivers genuine compatibility or follow through. Bumble specifically saw paying users drop 16% year over year in recent quarters, with revenue falling 10% in one period alone. And even with attempts at artificial intelligence conversation tools and product overhauls, the resistance to paying for features that do not solve the underlying problems of low match quality for average men or emotional drain for everyone involved keeps growing because users spend close to 50 minutes a day on some platforms only to face the same cycle of superficial swipes, repetitive openers, and eventual ghosting that leaves most feeling more exhausted than connected. Gen Z reports burnout rates hitting 78%, sometimes often or always, with millennials close behind at 80%, according to health surveys. And this exhaustion stems from the gamified design that treats human interaction like endless loot boxes, keeping people hooked through variable rewards without building sustainable paths to real world meetings or emotional bonds. And men are leading the exit by simply deleting accounts and redirecting that time and money toward personal development gym routines or hobbies that deliver tangible returns instead of feeding platforms that profit from their frustration. The broader demographic picture reveals marriage rates sitting at historic lows, around 6.2 per 1,000 people in recent years, down significantly from earlier decades, while the median age for first marriage has climbed to 30.8 for men and 28.4 for women, reflecting deliberate delays or outright opting out among younger cohorts, where nearly a quarter of 40-year-olds have never married compared to just 6% in 1980, and projections suggest a third or more of those born in the early 21st century may never tie the knot at all, as economic pressures, cultural messages, and observed relationship risks combine to make the traditional path feel less automatic and more like a high stakes gamble with uncertain payoffs. Single rates among men under 30 reach 63% in some analyses, while women in the same group sit closer to 34%, highlighting the gender divergence where men are more comfortable remaining independent and women express greater desire for partnership, yet face challenges inspiring consistent pursuit from the very men they hope will step up. Because past patterns of rewarding short term excitement over stable effort have trained many guys to prioritize self protection and peace over chasing diminishing returns in a market that feels stacked against balanced investment. Young adults still voice aspirations for serious relationships, with 83% of women and 74% of men endorsing dating cultures aimed at emotional connections and long term potential. But actual behavior shows only about 30% actively dating once a month or more, with nearly three-quarters of women and two-thirds of men reporting minimal or no dating activity in the past year, which points to a genuine recession in courtship driven by calculated withdrawal rather than sudden disinterest in companionship itself. Loneliness data adds another layer to the story because while overall rates hover around 16% of adults feeling isolated all or most of the time, with little statistical gap between men and women, the substance of those feelings differs in how people respond, with women more likely to reach out to wider networks for emotional support, and men tending toward self reliance or quieter processing that can mask deeper voids until they build resilience through purpose and routine rather than constant relational input. Surveys sometimes flip the narrative, showing younger men reporting higher loneliness in certain brackets, yet the trend across studies indicates universal increases, especially among those under 30, where social circles have shrunk for everyone due to digital shifts, work demands, and the erosion of organic community spaces that once facilitated low pressure interactions. And men who embrace minimalist self focus often report greater satisfaction once they stop measuring fulfillment solely through romantic validation and instead invest in skills, achievements, and personal boundaries that provide internal stability without external drama. Women, on the other hand, frequently describe the weight of solo life in practical and emotional terms, from handling daily logistics alone to facing quiet evenings without shared conversation. And that contrast underscores how independence solves certain survival needs, but leaves relational cravings unmet when the complementary structures of mutual contribution and respect are absent or redefined in ways that feel one sided. The philosophical observations from Schopenhauer continue to resonate when examined through modern patterns, because he described women as adapted more to suffering through childbearing care and subjection rather than grand actions or heavy mental labor, seeing them as big children all their lives, intermediate between actual childhood and full male reasoning with a focus on the near at hand appearances and trifling matters over sustained abstract justice or long term consequences. And while his language strikes contemporary ears as blunt, the underlying distinction about instinctual priorities helps explain why certain cultural pushes for uniform roles ignore biological and psychological realities that surface repeatedly in mismatched expectations and accountability gaps. He argued that women pay the debt of life through patient companionship and endurance rather than through intellectual or physical feats assigned more naturally to men. And that lens sheds light on why dynamics shift when those complementary roles get disrupted by narratives that treat provision and protection as optional or oppressive, while demanding continued emotional or financial input without equivalent reciprocity or appreciation for the effort involved. Men absorbing these historical insights alongside daily evidence stop expecting identical logical frameworks from both sides and instead adjust their behavior towards self preservation, recognizing that feelings driven decision making often prioritizes immediate validation over the patient building required for stable bonds, and that adjustment manifests as reduced pursuit, reduced funding of unbalanced systems, and increased focus on lives that align with male nature centered on purpose, competence, and quiet strength. Economic survival plays into the attitudes of younger generations, where some Gen Z voices express more traditional leanings toward marriage before children or viewing partnership as practical support rather than pure romance, yet actual formation rates lag because the observed landscape of high divorce risks financial extraction in courts, and the exhaustion from app based interactions makes rushing feel unwise, and many delay until personal foundations feel solid enough to mitigate the vulnerabilities that come with vulnerability in unbalanced modern setups. Projections for 2030 suggest nearly half of women aged 25 to 44 could be single, marking a historic shift where marriage is no longer the default milestone, and that change stems from cumulative choices across decades, where independence was elevated without fully accounting for the trade offs in emotional, logistical, and demographic terms that now surface as birth rates decline. Sex frequency drops, and stable pairings become rarer, especially among those shaped by messages framing men as disposable or masculinity as inherently problematic. The dating recession described in recent analysis shows young adults strongly preferring serious relationship focused cultures, yet struggling to bridge the gap between aspiration and action, because men have grown wary of overextending in environments where entitlement mixed signals and low reciprocity dominate, and women face the challenge of inspiring investment from guys who have learned through pattern recognition to guard their resources and energy carefully after seeing how quickly effort can be undervalued or weaponized in social and legal contexts. Direct boundary setting and clear communication have emerged as essential tools for men navigating this terrain, because stating intentions early filters out situations where basic gestures get reframed as obligations without mutual energy returning, and rejection becomes a healthy sorting mechanism rather than a personal failure, allowing guys to conserve effort for connections that show genuine alignment instead of chasing volume or hoping for change in guarded dynamics that replace youthful openness with calculated independence. At community events or everyday settings, the visible imbalance with women often outnumbering engaged men reflects how many have assessed the available pool and decided that pursuing those seeking logistical rescue after years of celebrating self sufficiency does not spark the kind of committed leadership that thrives on mutual respect and feminine receptivity rather than managing past choices or elevated standards that shifted once prime years passed. Appreciation dies quickly when effort feels owed, and men have internalized that lesson across enough experiences where flowers, thoughtful planning, or consistent presence get treated as bare minimum while demands for more escalate without equivalent contribution. And the rational response is to redirect that energy inward toward self mastery, financial security, and hobbies that deliver reliable satisfaction without the risk of disruption from cycles of chaos created for attention or validation. The supply and demand mechanics governing attraction and commitment remain unforgiving, because as women age into their 30s and 40s, the pool of men willing to commit long term contracts with guarded or entitled energy shrinks, while younger options with higher energy and fewer complications increase competition. And good men who have refined themselves through independence gain leverage to be selective or stay single without the same societal pressure that once pushed early pairing, and ignoring that arithmetic only amplifies confusion when approaches and consistent follow through disappear, or leaving many wondering where the decent options went, when in reality many are present, but choosing peace over settling for dynamics that feel like delayed help requests rather than equal partnerships built from the start. Social media accelerates awareness by exposing raw patterns in real time through countless examples of entitlement, blame shifting, and mixed messaging, which desensitizes men to traditional courtship scripts and reinforces the wisdom of minimalist living, where unnecessary complications get shed and focus narrows to what genuinely supports long term happiness and resilience without the emotional tax that unbalanced interactions often impose. Birth rates hitting record lows and sex rates continuing their decline, tied directly to this withdrawal, because fewer stable pairings form when men calculate the risks of family court financial burdens and emotional labor that goes unreciprocated, and women encounter the practical limits of solo life when relational fulfillment and shared burdens remain unmet despite career or financial gains that solve only part of the human equation. Men comfortable in singlehood under 30 often report greater peace once they stop tying worth to romantic success and instead build identities around competence, purpose, and self directed routines that provide internal validation without depending on external approval that can shift unpredictably based on feelings or social trends. And this self reliance contrasts with the voids many women describe like in later years, where independence handles survival but leaves gaps in companionship intimacy, and the simple sharing of ordinary days that give life deeper texture and support through challenges. The philosophical depth from earlier thinkers highlights how instinctual drives toward species level concerns or immediate emotional priorities can clash with individual judgment and justice oriented thinking, more common in men, leading to patterns where accountability gets avoided and consequences get externalized rather than reflected upon, which compounds isolation when protective buffers withdraw and reality lands directly without the softening that once came from mutual roles. This correction in relationship markets represents decades of cultural messaging sinking in fully, where men heard they were optional, toxic, or unnecessary, and responded by becoming exactly that in the old framework, opting for lives of quiet strength and self focus that no longer pour resources into systems or dynamics offering low or negative returns, and women now face the resulting silence, forcing confrontation with choices that prioritized short term independence or validation over the patient structures that historically sustained families and communities through complementary strengths. Demographic forecasts point to continued rises in never married populations with record shares in prime age groups as economic uncertainty, cultural shifts, and observed imbalances make the old default path feel less inevitable and more like a deliberate choice requiring strong foundations that many delay building amid the noise of app fatigue and social narratives that downplay trade offs. Gen Z shows pockets of traditionalist thinking with more openness to marriage before children than previous cohorts, yet actual behavior lags because the practical landscape includes high burnout from digital dating, low confidence in approaching due to risk awareness and preference for personal growth first, which delays formation, while men in particular embrace the freedom of independence without the pressure to perform provider roles in environments where appreciation for consistency has eroded. The loneliness conversation evolves as data reveals universal increases rather than strict gender dominance, yet the ways people cope differ, with men leaning into self containment and purpose, while women often seek wider networks, which can highlight relational gaps more acutely when those networks fail to fill intimate voids left by declining pairing rates. And that difference underscores why the male withdrawal creates visible ripple effects on one side, even as both genders navigate broader social isolation trends driven by digital life and eroded community ties. Schopenhauer noted that women see only what is near, clinging to the present and preferring trifles, which aligns with dynamics where immediate validation through apps or social chaos takes precedence over sustained effort needed for bonds that endure. And men who recognize this distinction stop projecting their own logical reciprocity onto interactions and instead protect their frame by disengaging from cycles that drain without building, which manifests as canceled subscriptions, reduced approaches, and deliberate minimalist lives focused on what serves long term peace rather than temporary highs or societal expectations. Entitlement undermines the very connections it seeks because when basic human gestures get reframed as obligations without gratitude, the motivation to continue evaporates. And repeated exposure to that pattern across dating culture trains men to value their own time and energy more highly, choosing solitude or casual low investment over heavy pursuit that risks one sided investment or later regret when options narrow and demands shift. At larger social gatherings, the gender skew becomes evident with women present in higher numbers, yet men holding back because inspiration to lead or invest requires seeing genuine mutual value and receptivity from the outset rather than navigating guarded independence or past choices that signal higher risk for unbalanced outcomes. And good men calculate accordingly, prioritizing self alignment over filling perceived gaps created by earlier priorities. this entire landscape reveals a market correction where supply and demand for commitment have realigned, with men controlling access to serious investment, while initial attention remains more abundant on the other side, creating imbalances that favor those unwilling to overpay for guarded or entitled returns after prime years of openness have passed. And the resulting confusion stems from failing to link collective behaviors to the exhaustion men feel after enough cycles of mixed signals and low reciprocity, which leads to permanent adjustments rather than temporary frustration. Projections for singlehood rising toward half in certain female age brackets by 2030 signal a new normal where traditional milestones lose default status, and individuals on both sides must navigate personal responsibility for outcomes rather than expecting external systems or the opposite gender to buffer consequences indefinitely. And men thriving in that space do so through self mastery and boundary enforcement that replaces old provider scripts with deliberate choices serving their nature and long term security. The sobering truth is that human connections thrive on reciprocity, respect, and complementary strengths rather than demands or avoidance of accountability. And when those foundations erode, the natural response from those bearing disproportionate costs is withdrawal, which forces everyone to confront the raw patterns underneath comforting narratives and rebuild on honest terms or accept the isolation that follows from ignoring observable reality. The minimalist revolution among men continues gaining quiet momentum as they shed excess complications, focus resources on competence and comfort, and rediscover satisfaction in self directed paths that do not require constant negotiation or performance to maintain equilibrium, which feels profoundly freeing after years of cultural pressure, framing natural traits as problems needing correction. And that rediscovery allows genuine happiness built on internal standards rather than external validation that proved unreliable or costly in unbalanced modern interactions. Demographic shifts toward later or foregone marriage reflect calculated awareness of risks, including financial extraction and legal systems' emotional labor without appreciation and the general fatigue from environments where entitlement kills gratitude, and men respond by holding firm on boundaries, refusing to fund or participate in systems that treat them primarily as utilities rather than equals in value exchange. Women encountering the practical and emotional limits of prolonged independence often voice the weight of carrying full loads alone, from logistics to inner processing, and those reflections highlight how survival gets addressed, but deeper needs for shared intimacy and support persist, creating voids that careers or digital connections rarely fill completely. And the gap between souled empowerment and lived experience drives some toward regret. Narratives that arrive after options for stable pairing have narrowed through biological and social arithmetic. This wake up call spreads as more connect historical philosophy to contemporary data, recognizing that instincts prioritizing immediate feelings or species level propagation can lead to self sabotage when unchecked by sustained reasoning, and men absorbing that depth make permanent shifts towards self preservation, trusting pattern recognition over words or trends that shift with cultural winds. And the result is a society reconfiguring around reduced pairing rates, lower family formation, and individuals on both sides adapting to new realities where personal accountability replaces buffered consequences, and peace comes from aligning life with observable truths rather than ideological promises that ignored human nature. The dating recession persists because aspirations for emotional connections clash with behaviors shaped by burnout, risk aversion, and mismatched incentives, where platforms profit from engagement without delivering fulfillment, and real world interactions suffer from eroded trust after years of mixed messaging that trained caution over pursuit, and the long term outcome may be slower formation of bonds, but potentially more deliberate ones among those who navigate the landscape with clear eyes and strong boundaries. Industry data from recent years confirms the dating sector generated roughly $6.18 billion in global revenue during 2024, with Match Group alone accounting for 3.5 billion of that total, while the overall user base exceeds 350 million people worldwide, and projections point toward continued downloads surpassing 1.46 billion in 2025. Yet paying subscribers remain concentrated among a smaller core group of roughly 25 million, despite the massive total audience, because men have increasingly stepped away from premium features and boosts that promise visibility but deliver minimal, genuine compatibility or sustained interest in return for the investment. Bumble reported 866 million in revenue for 2024, marking a modest 2% rise. Yet earlier quarters showed paying user fluctuations, with some periods reflecting drops, as users, particularly men, grew weary of the emotional and financial costs associated with platforms that rely on variable reward mechanics to maintain engagement without resolving core issues like low quality matches for average profiles, or the constant navigation of superficial interactions that rarely translate into real world connections worth pursuing. Tinder, under the Match umbrella, continues to dominate in user volume but faces similar headwinds as overall industry growth slows in mature markets where fatigue sets in after repeated cycles of swiping openers that lead nowhere, and ghosting that leaves participants questioning the value of dedicating time and resources to systems designed more for retention than successful pairing, and the emergence of niche apps like one focused on short-term encounters hitting 100 million in revenue with strong user growth highlights how segments catering to lower commitment preferences can still capture spending, while broader relationship-oriented platforms struggle to retain the male payers who once subsidized the ecosystem. Census figures released in late 2025 reveal that fewer than half of United States households now qualify as married couple households, sitting at around 47%, a sharp contrast to the two-thirds figure from 50 years earlier. And this decline coincides with the median age at first marriage reaching 30.8 for men and 28.4 for women, up significantly from the early 20s levels seen in the 1970s, as more individuals delay or forego the step altogether amid economic pressures, observed risks, and shifting priorities that make early commitment feel less like a natural progression and more like a deliberate choice requiring strong personal foundations. Marriage rates themselves hover near 6.2 per 1,000 population in recent data, down from higher figures in prior decades, and projections suggest that as many as one third of those turning 45 around 2050 may never marry, reflecting a trajectory where only about 60% of 35-year-old men today have ever married compared to 90% in 1980, and similar patterns among women underscore how the institution has lost its default status for large segments of younger cohorts who weigh the potential downsides more heavily than previous generations did. Gen Z expresses relatively positive views toward marriage, with surveys indicating 81% openness and half stating they definitely see it in their future, while 78% of that group and 73% of millennials among the unmarried still aspire to wed someday, yet actual behavior shows high single rates, with 46% of Gen Z reporting no partner in some polls, and overall dating activity remaining low as aspirations clash with the practical landscape of burnout risk awareness and calculated caution around investment in unbalanced dynamics. Loneliness affects roughly 16% of adults feeling isolated all or most of the time, with nearly equal shares between men and women. according to recent Pew findings, and about 38% experiencing it sometimes, while 47% report hardly ever or never, which indicates the issue has become broadly distributed rather than confined to one gender, even as coping mechanisms differ, with women more inclined to reach out to wider networks for emotional support, and men tending toward less frequent communication with friends and lower reliance on external outlets for processing feelings. Some data points to variations by age, where younger men in certain brackets report higher rates, around 25% for those 15 to 34, compared to 18% for women in the same group, while other surveys flip the emphasis among teens, with girls showing elevated feelings of loneliness, and overall trends confirm increases across the board, particularly among those under 30, as social circles shrink due to digital habits, work demands, and the erosion of traditional community spaces that once supported organic, low pressure connections. Adults 45 and older show loneliness rising to 40% in recent studies with men in that cohort, reporting slightly higher rates at 42% versus 37% for women, marking a shift from earlier parity, and the universal growth in isolation highlights how broader societal factors like reduced in person interactions and heightened awareness of relational gaps amplify the experience regardless of gender, while responses vary based on tendencies towards self containment or outward seeking of support. Fertility rates in the United States hit a record low of 1.6 births per woman in 2024, with slight further declines noted into 2025, and projections from the Congressional Budget Office anticipate stabilization around 1.6 through the mid 2030s before modest drops, which falls well below the replacement level of 2.1 needed for stable population without immigration. And this downward trajectory aligns with global patterns, where rates have fallen from over 5 in the 1960s to around 2.2 by 2023, as economic costs of child rearing, job insecurity, housing challenges, and concerns about future stability deter many from having the number of children they might otherwise desire. Teenage birth rates have plummeted 79% to 12.7 per 1,000 for ages 15 to 19, representing a significant public health success through education and access to contraception. Yet the overall fertility decline raises questions about long term demographic sustainability, as fewer stable pairings form, and individuals on both sides navigate environments where commitment feels riskier or less incentivized amid the observed imbalances in dating culture and relationship expectations. 1 in 5 people globally expect not to reach their desired family size, according to broader surveys, with barriers including prohibitive parenthood costs, fear of the future, and lack of suitable partners contributing to the gap between aspirations and outcomes. And in the United States, the slight drop in births during 2025 confirms that earlier minor upticks did not signal a reversal, but rather continuation of trends tied to delayed pairing economic pressures and the preference for personal stability before expanding into family responsibilities that require mutual investment, many now view warily. These demographic realities interconnect with the withdrawal patterns because as marriage and birth rates decline, the natural buffer of family structures that once distributed emotional and practical loads weakens, leaving more individuals to confront isolation or self reliance in ways that feel heavier when relational options narrow. And men who have embraced minimalist approaches often report internal satisfaction from focusing on competence, purpose, and personal routines that provide reliable anchors without depending on external validation that can prove fleeting or costly in modern interactions. Women encountering the limits of prolonged independence frequently describe the cumulative weight of managing logistics, emotional processing, and daily life without shared support, which solves certain survival aspects through career or financial means, but leaves deeper cravings for companionship and mutual holding. Unmet, creating a contrast where independence delivers autonomy, yet struggles to replicate the resilience that came from complementary roles built on reciprocity and respect rather than one sided demands or avoidance of accountability for choices made when options were more abundant. The philosophical distinctions noted by earlier observers like Schopenhauer about differing temperaments, where one side may prioritize immediate concerns, appearances, and species level instincts, while the other leans towards sustained judgment, justice, and individual reasoning, help frame why certain cultural shifts led to mismatches that now surface as reduced pairing and heightened awareness of gaps, because denying those differences in favor of uniform expectations ignored the practical outcomes that emerge when feelings driven. Avoidance of long term consequences clashes with the need for patient contribution and mutual value exchange. Economic incentives within the dating sector push platforms toward constant innovation, like artificial intelligence conversation starters or authenticity verification. Yet user resistance, particularly from men who refuse to subsidize features that do not address fundamental problems of adverse selection. Low reciprocity and emotional exhaustion keeps revenue growth uneven and niche. Successes in lower commitment categories demonstrate how preferences for minimal investment can still generate substantial returns, while broader apps oriented towards serious connections face challenges retaining the engagement needed to sustain their models when participants calculate that peace and independence often outweighs the risks of unbalanced pursuit. Gen Z shows mixed signals with more traditionalist leanings in some surveys, expressing openness to marriage before children or viewing partnership as practical support, yet high single rates and delayed formation persist because the observed environment includes fatigue from digital interactions, caution around legal and financial risks, and a preference for establishing personal boundaries and growth first, which delays the kind of early investment that historically supported higher pairing and family formation rates among previous cohorts. The friendship recession discussed in various analyses reveals that while close friend counts average around 5 for both genders with minimal gaps in recent data, the quality and frequency of those connections matter because men communicate less often and turn to networks less for emotional support, which can mask deeper processing needs until self reliance builds resilience, while women maintain wider circles that sometimes highlight relational voids more acutely when intimate partnerships remain absent. Coping mechanisms during periods of isolation differ in substance, even when overall loneliness rates appear comparable, with men more likely to internalize and focus on self directed activities that foster competence and quiet strength, while women often seek broader outreach, which can provide temporary relief, but also underscore gaps when those networks fail to substitute for deeper one on one bonds. And this divergence explains why the male shift toward reduced engagement creates visible effects on the relational market, even as both sides navigate universal increases in disconnection, driven by digital life eroded, community ties, and cultural narratives that downplayed the trade offs of prioritizing independence over mutual structures. Regret cycles emerge more noticeably in later years when biological and social arithmetic catch up with delayed choices as options for stable, long term pairing narrow through increased competition from younger energy, and the realization that guarded versions of connection offered after prime periods of openness do not inspire the same level of commitment from men who have refined themselves through self focus and now prioritize peace over settling for dynamics that carry higher perceived risk or lower mutual value from the outset. Boundary enforcement and direct communication serve as practical filters in contemporary courtship because stating clear intentions up front helps sort situations where basic efforts might otherwise get reframed as obligations without equivalent energy returning, and rejection functions as an efficient tool for conserving resources rather than investing heavily in prospects showing signs of entitlement, mixed signals, or moving goalposts that shift once initial attention secures without building reciprocal foundations. Societal reconfiguration unfolds as reduced pairing rates lead to smaller households, more one person living arrangements, and slower family formation, which strains certain support systems, while simultaneously allowing individuals who embrace self reliance to thrive through deliberate minimalist paths that shed unnecessary complications and concentrate energy on what delivers genuine long term satisfaction and resilience without the emotional tax of navigating unbalanced expectations or funding systems that treat one side primarily as a resource rather than an equal participant in value exchange. Historical insights on instinct versus sustained reasoning illuminate why pushing uniform roles without accounting for complementary strengths contributed to the current landscape where accountability gaps and feelings prioritized over consequences compound into isolation when protective buffers withdraw and reality confronts people directly, forcing adaptation through personal responsibility rather than continued reliance on external narratives that buffered outcomes for decades. The dating recession persists because high aspirations for emotional depth and long term potential collide with behaviors shaped by burnout, risk aversion, and incentives that favor volume over quality in digital spaces, while real world trust erodes after years of patterns that rewarded short term validation at the expense of consistent effort, leading to more deliberate but slower formation among those who approach with clear eyes and strong self alignment. Projections for household composition show continued growth in single person units reaching 29% of all households in 2025, up from 20% in 1975, as marriage loses ground and cohabitation or independent living becomes more common, reflecting calculated choices where economic uncertainty, cultural shifts, and observed relational imbalances make rushing into commitments feel less prudent and more like a high stakes decision, requiring solid personal footing that many prioritize building first amid the noise of platform fatigue and social messages that emphasized autonomy without fully addressing the human need for interdependence. Men comfortable with single life often derive satisfaction from routines centered on purpose, competence, and personal mastery, which provide internal validation that does not fluctuate with external trends or feelings based shifts, allowing them to maintain equilibrium without the constant performance or negotiation that many modern interactions demand. And this self containment contrasts with descriptions from the other side, where independence handles practical survival but leaves emotional and logistical voids that careers, social media, or casual networks rarely fill completely, creating a gap between the promised freedom and the lived texture of daily existence. The minimalist approach, gaining traction, involves removing excess burdens accumulated through societal expectations of endless provision and instead narrowing focus to elements that support genuine comfort and growth, which feels liberating after cultural pressures framed natural male traits as issues requiring suppression or correction. And that rediscovery enables happiness rooted in alignment with observable realities rather than ideological constructs that ignored pattern recognition and long term consequences. This broader adaptation signals a market correction where supply and demand for serious commitment have realigned, with men exercising greater selectivity or opting for independence when returns feel disproportionate to the investment required. And women face the challenge of inspiring pursuit from those who have internalized lessons from repeated cycles of undervalued effort or entitlement that killed appreciation and led to permanent withdrawal from the old scripts of chasing or subsidizing unbalanced dynamics. Philosophical extensions on honesty, judgment, and role differences underscore how ignoring instinctual drivers in favor of enforced equality overlooked the practical outcomes that now manifest as demographic slowdowns and heightened awareness of isolation, forcing both sides to confront the raw mechanics of human connection that thrive on reciprocity, mutual respect, and complementary contributions rather than demands avoidance of accountability or reliance on feelings as the primary guide for decisions with lasting impact. The regret mechanisms tied to delayed stability become evident when prime years of high energy and openness pass without building the patient foundations that sustain through ordinary challenges, and men who witnessed or experienced those patterns choose self preservation, trusting actions over words, and prioritizing lives that serve their nature without pouring resources into situations offering low likelihood of balanced exchange or enduring peace. Ultimately, the societal shift towards self reliant configurations reflects the sobering accumulation of choices across generations, where messages framing one group as optional or problematic produce the logical response of disengagement. And now, as pairing rates slow, birth numbers decline and households diversify, individuals must navigate personal accountability for outcomes in environments where buffered consequences give way to direct confrontation with human nature in its observable forms. And those who adapt through clear boundaries, deliberate focus, and alignment with reality discover forms of satisfaction that replace the old cycles of pursuit, disappointment, and resource drain with quiet strength and genuine self directed fulfillment. The patterns driving men to step back permanently from unbalanced games reveal deeper truths about instinct, emotional priorities, and the limits of denying complementary dynamics, which, when ignored, lead to the very isolation and reconfiguration now unfolding. And the wake up lies in recognizing that sustainable connections require honest reciprocity from the start rather than expecting adjustments after the fact when arithmetic of age competition and refined selectivity has already narrowed the field for those who delayed investment in mutual value. Census data from 2025 confirms that fewer than half of United States households qualify as married couple households at 47%, marking a stark departure from the two-thirds share recorded 50 years prior when the figure stood near 66%. And this transition coincides with the median age at first marriage climbing to 30.8 for men and 28.4 for women, compared to 23.5 and 21.1 respectively in 1975, as more people opt to delay or bypass the step amid weighing practical risks and personal priorities that make early formal commitment feel like a calculated decision rather than an automatic life stage. Marriage rates hover around 6.2 per 1,000 population, in recent figures representing a continued drop from 8.2 in 2000, and the crude divorce rate sits at approximately 2.4 per 1,000, reflecting some stabilization and stability among those who do marry. Yet overall first marriage rates have declined more than 10% over the past 2 decades, with demographers estimating that as many as one-third of young adults born in the early decades of the 21st century may never marry at all, as the average age for first marriage approaches 30, and aspirations for partnership encounter the friction of observed imbalances in effort, reciprocity, and long term security. Barna research indicates that about half of United States adults are married today at roughly 46 to 51%, depending on the measure, down from two-thirds in 1950, while most unmarried adults still express hope to marry someday, though actual behavior shows millennials reaching 42%, married with low divorce shares at 5%, and boomers holding the highest lifetime divorce experience at 30%, which illustrates how generational timing and cultural exposure shape outcomes in pairing and dissolution patterns. One person households reached 39.7 million in 2025, accounting for 29% of all households, up substantially from 20% in 1975, as solo living becomes the most common arrangement in many contexts, surpassing couples with children, which fell to around 24% by 2015 from 43% in 1960. And this rise in independent living arrangements ties into broader trends where unpartnered adults sit near 42% in 2023 after a modest decline from 44% in 2019, while cohabitation with an unmarried partner edged up to 7%, reflecting diverse household formations that prioritize personal autonomy amid economic considerations and relational caution. Projections suggest population growth slowing sharply, with the Congressional Budget Office anticipating fertility rates for native born women at 1.53 in 2026, declining further to 1.50 by 2032 and stabilizing there, while overall births hovered near 3.6 million in 2025, with a slight dip of around 24,000 from the prior year, pushing the total fertility rate to a record low of 1.6 births per woman in 2024 and holding near that level into 2025, which remains well below the replacement threshold of 2.1 needed for population stability, absent immigration, and raises questions about future workforce sustainability, pension burdens, and the strain on systems designed around higher family formation rates from earlier eras. Teenage birth rates have dropped dramatically by 79% to 12.7 per 1,000 for ages 15 to 19, which counts as a clear public health achievement through better education and contraceptive access. Yet the overall fertility slowdown affects all age groups, with the largest recent declines among younger mothers, and global comparisons show the United States at 1.6 in 2025, consistent with developed world trends, where rates have fallen from over 5 in the 1960s to around 2.2 by 2023, as factors like increased educational attainment among women, delayed marriage housing costs, and concerns about long term stability deter many from reaching desired family sizes, with 1 in 5 people worldwide expecting to fall short of their ideal number of children. Economic analyses warn that sustained low fertility could cost the economy tens of billions annually in lost growth potential, with one estimate placing the figure near $100 billion due to smaller future labor forces and reduced consumer bases, while immigration adjustments and policy shifts further influence projections, with net international migration expected to decline and natural change flattening, which could lead to historically low overall population growth near 1.8 million in 2025, down from 3.2 million the year before, and potentially approaching zero by 2056 under certain scenarios combining low births and moderated inflows. Loneliness affects about 16% of adults feeling isolated all or most of the time, with roughly equal shares for men and women at 16% each, while 38% report it sometimes and 47% hardly ever or never, according to Pew findings. Though age plays a stronger role, with adults under 50 at 22% often lonely versus 9% for those 50 and older, and adults 65 and older most likely to report hardly ever or never at 66%, which highlights how life stage and social circle changes influence the experience even as gender gaps remain minimal overall. Gallup data points to variations where 25% of United States men aged 15 to 34 felt lonely a lot the previous day, higher than the national average of 18% and exceeding young women at 18% in that bracket, while some surveys show women aged 35 to 54 at 20% compared to an OECD median of 14%, indicating contextual differences by subgroup. Yet the broader trend confirms rising disconnection across demographics driven by digital habits, reduced in person community ties, and the erosion of structures that once facilitated organic support networks. AARP research finds 40% of adults 45 and older reporting loneliness with particular elevation among those 45 to 49 at 49%, never married at 62%, not working at 57%, and lower income below $25,000 at 63%, while Cigna Vitality Index data shows Gen Z at 67% lonely, millennials at 65%, Gen X at 60%, and baby boomers at 44%, with lonely individuals across generations reporting significantly lower vitality scores, which links the feeling to broader impacts on mental and physical well being that compound when relational buffers weaken. These demographic and emotional patterns interconnect with the male withdrawal from traditional dating investment because men who embrace self directed, minimalist paths often build internal resilience through competence, purpose, and routine that provides steady satisfaction without relying on external romantic validation that can fluctuate unpredictably, while women more frequently describe practical and emotional loads accumulating in solo arrangements that address survival through career or financial independence, but leave gaps in shared companionship and mutual support that wider networks or digital connections rarely fill completely, creating a contrast in how independence manifests across genders. Niche platforms catering to lower commitment preferences have achieved notable success, with one short term focused app reaching $100 million in annual gross revenue alongside 95% year over year registration growth and 46% revenue increase in 2025, even as major players report contractions like 14% decline for Tinder, 11% for Bumble, and 12% for Hinge in early 2025 quarters, which demonstrates how user preferences shift toward minimal investment options when broader relationship oriented spaces feel exhausting or unbalanced. And the overall market still generated $6.18 billion globally in 2024, with Match Group contributing $3.5 billion. Yet paying subscribers remain limited to around 25 million out of over 350 million total users worldwide, signaling widespread fatigue with premium features that fail to deliver proportional value, incompatibility, or follow through. Artificial intelligence tools introduced for conversation starters or profile enhancement show limited success in bridging core compatibility gaps because they address surface level engagement without resolving deeper issues of adverse selection, low reciprocity, or the emotional drain from repetitive cycles that leave participants questioning the return on time spent. And platforms continue experimenting with verification, authenticity measures, and product overhauls, yet resistance from men who refuse to subsidize features, yielding one, like every couple of weeks for average profiles, keeps revenue growth uneven, with iOS accounting for roughly 80% of mobile earnings in the United States, remaining the largest single market projected to exceed $3 billion in 2025, while China and the United Kingdom follow with substantial but secondary contributions. Coping mechanisms during isolation reveal nuanced differences even when overall rates appear comparable, with men more inclined towards self containment and focus on personal mastery that fosters quiet strength over time, while women often tap into broader arrays of support, including friends, family, mental health professionals, or online communities, which can provide immediate relief but also accentuate voids when those sources cannot replicate the depth of intimate partnership. And this divergence helps explain why reduced male engagement in pursuit or funding creates pronounced effects in the relational marketplace, despite universal rises in disconnection tied to modern lifestyles and cultural emphases on autonomy. Philosophical considerations around endurance, companionship, and justice in relational roles extend the earlier observations by highlighting how sustained mutual contribution builds resilience that unilateral independence struggles to match when daily burdens or emotional processing fall entirely on one individual, and men who internalize lessons from pattern recognition prioritize lives aligned with observable realities rather than continuing cycles where effort gets undervalued or reframed as obligation, which leads to deliberate boundary setting that filters situations lacking genuine alignment from the outset and preserves resources for self directed growth that delivers reliable internal equilibrium. Regret patterns linked to prioritizing career advancement or casual validation in prime years surface more clearly later when biological and social dynamics narrow options through heightened competition from younger energy and the realization that guarded connections offered after periods of openness do not spark the same commitment from men who have honed selectivity through experience and now favor peace over dynamics carrying elevated perceived risk or lower mutual value exchange, which underscores the arithmetic of timing and choice in shaping long term outcomes for pairing and family formation. Household diversification trends show continued expansion of solo and cohabiting arrangements with one person, units at 29% in 2025, and unpartnered adults near 42%, reflecting calculated adaptations where economic uncertainty observed relational imbalances and preference for personal foundations, delay or redefine traditional milestones, and men comfortable in singlehood derive satisfaction from routines emphasizing competence and self mastery that provide validation independent of fluctuating external approval, while the minimalist ethos involves shedding accumulated expectations of endless provision to concentrate energy on elements supporting genuine comfort and long term security, which feels profoundly freeing after cultural narratives framed natural traits as requiring correction or suppression. Societal adaptation to slower pairing and lower fertility involves confronting strains on systems built around higher population growth, such as workforce sustainability and support for aging cohorts, while individuals who navigate with clear boundaries and alignment to reality discover forms of fulfillment that replace older cycles of disproportionate investment with quiet strength rooted in personal accountability and observable patterns rather than buffered illusions that delayed direct consequences for decades. The evolving economic models of dating platforms reveal ongoing tension between user resistance to subsidizing unbalanced experiences and niche successes in minimal commitment segments that capture spending through targeted appeal, while major apps face challenges retaining male payers amid burnout and perceptions of rigged incentives favoring volume over quality, which accelerates shifts toward organic or low pressure interactions where men apply direct communication to sort prospects efficiently and conserve effort for connections showing reciprocal energy from the start rather than hoping for change in dynamics marked by entitlement or moving expectations. Further philosophical depth on justice and honesty in roles illuminates how denying complementary strengths in favor of uniform approaches contributed to mismatches that now manifest as demographic slowdowns and reconfiguration of living arrangements, forcing confrontation with human nature in its raw forms, where sustainable bonds require reciprocity and mutual respect, built consistently rather than demanded after the fact, when selectivity and refined independence have already reshaped the landscape for those who delayed investment in balanced foundations. Long term impacts on aging populations include potential pressures on pension and healthcare systems from smaller cohorts entering working age, which compounds with flat natural change and moderated immigration to slow overall growth, and individuals adapting through self reliant configurations emphasize personal mastery that mitigates isolation by focusing on purpose and routine, while the regret mechanisms associated with validation priorities in youth highlight the cost of straying from patient building that historically sustained communities through shared loads and complementary contributions, which, when eroded, leave gaps that independence alone cannot fully bridge, regardless of financial or career achievements. This comprehensive shift represents a market and cultural correction where decades of messaging about optionality or toxicity produced the predictable response of disengagement. And now, as marriage rates stabilize at lower levels, fertility holds below replacement, and households diversify. Both men and women navigate personal responsibility for outcomes in environments where protective buffers have withdrawn, exposing the mechanics of connection that thrive on honest exchange from early stages rather than adjustments prompted by narrowed options or accumulated voids. The wake up call embedded in these observable trends calls for facing the full scope of instinctual drivers, emotional priorities, and the limits of ideological overrides that ignored pattern recognition, leading to the very isolation and reconfiguration unfolding today. And men who hold the line on unbalanced participation discover freedom in minimalist self alignment that replaces resource drain with genuine peace, while society as a whole reorients toward diverse structures that reward deliberate choices grounded in reality over comforting scripts that buffered accountability for too long. Sustainable human flourishing emerges when reciprocity and complementary strengths guide interactions rather than demands or avoidance, which allows individuals to build resilience through aligned living. And the sobering truth is that all roads eventually lead back to recognizing these fundamentals. Once illusions fade and direct confrontation with consequences reveals what truly sustains people through ordinary and challenging times alike. If you are still with me this far and you have reached the end of this hour-long deep dive, then shout out to the 1 hour gang for sticking it out, because that shows you are serious about facing these truths head on. If you are enjoying these angry guy videos and they are giving you the straight talk you need, then show some support by buying me a Red Bull using the link in the description of the video. Tell me in the comments what you thought about what we discussed today, whether you agree with the patterns laid out, and share your own thoughts on how this shift is playing out in your life or what you see around you. Like the video if you like it, and do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.